I'm staring at three browser tabs I keep refreshing. One shows live traffic at the Port of Halifax. Another tracks monthly container volume at the Port of New York and New Jersey. The third contains a diplomatic message circulating among international law scholars, people who rarely use dramatic language in public. Yet the words in that cable are striking, unprecedented, and colonial. What I'm about to explain will likely change how you see this entire trade conflict. Not because of a new tariff or a fresh threat, but because of a demand so bold, so legally questionable, and so historically loaded that the moment it was made, the direction of the conflict suddenly became obvious. The answer isn't hidden in treaties or speeches. It's visible in something physical and measurable. Which ports are full and which ones are empty? Stick with me, because this moment may be the turning point. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe to Daily Brief. This story is unfolding quickly, and the situation at these ports is changing in real time. Let's rewind, not weeks or months, but to the moment the demand appeared. This wasn't a rumor or a leak. It arrived through official diplomatic channels. The U.S. State Department sent a formal proposal to Canada's Foreign Ministry, describing what it called bilateral port cooperation measures. Shortly afterward, the idea surfaced publicly when Donald Trump told reporters that Canadian ports were handling trade that should be moving through American ones. He argued that billions of dollars worth of cargo that historically flowed through ports like New York or Savannah was now moving through Halifax and Vancouver because of what he called unfair Canadian agreements. Then came the key point. Washington said it wanted access, authority, and a share of the revenue generated by that trade. Read that carefully. This wasn't about lowering tariffs or adjusting customs rules. The request involved operational authority. U.S. customs officials working inside Canadian ports with jurisdictional power, ports built with Canadian investment, operated by Canadian workers, governed by Canadian law. Canada's response came quickly. Just 4 hours later, Mark Carney answered in 2 sentences. Canadian ports are Canadian sovereign territory. This conversation is over. 14 words. The brevity mattered because the proposal was so far outside normal relations between sovereign countries that a longer response would have given it legitimacy. When someone demands the keys to your house, you don't debate, you simply say no. But to understand why Washington made such an extraordinary request, we need to look at what the ports themselves were already revealing. Start with Halifax. What was supposed to be a modest infrastructure upgrade, about $37 million, has effectively turned the port into a major North Atlantic logistics hub. Container traffic there has jumped more than 60% year over year, and numerous global shipping companies that once relied on American East Coast ports now route cargo through Halifax instead. Why? Speed and efficiency. Cargo can clear customs there in under 4 hours, compared with processing times in the United States that often stretch from 36 to 72 hours. That difference matters enormously to shipping companies operating on tight schedules. The port's revenue has surged, and expansion projects worth hundreds of millions are already underway to keep up with demand. And Halifax isn't the only example. On the Pacific side, Vancouver and Prince Rupert have experienced massive growth thanks to increased Asian trade and new supply chains. Container volumes at Vancouver have jumped over 40%, while Prince Rupert, already known for having the fastest shipping route from Asia to North America, has grown even faster. Together, these ports form part of an integrated system. Goods arrive from Asia on Canada's Pacific coast, cross the country by rail, and leave again through Atlantic ports bound for Europe. A full transcontinental trade corridor. Meanwhile, Montreal's port is handling increased European trade through the St. Lawrence corridor, adding yet another link to this network. The result is dramatic. Canadian port revenues have increased by billions of dollars annually since the trade war began. Now look at the other side of the equation. The Port of New York and New Jersey, historically the busiest complex on America's East Coast, has seen container traffic drop nearly 20% since shipping routes began shifting toward Halifax. Other American ports tell similar stories. Savannah, Norfolk, Charleston. Many are reporting declining international transit cargo, the most profitable category of shipping. On the West Coast, Los Angeles and Long Beach are also losing market share as more Asian trade moves through Canadian Pacific ports. The American Association of Port Authorities summarized the situation bluntly. These declines are structural, driven by trade policies that redirected commerce toward competing infrastructure. In other words, the market adapted. Instead of rebuilding competitiveness, Washington demanded access to the ports that were thriving. The proposal itself contained four main elements. First, Joint Customs Authority. U.S. officers stationed at Canadian ports with power to inspect or redirect shipments. Second, Priority Docking. Ships carrying American goods would receive guaranteed berth access at Canadian terminals. Third, Revenue Sharing. A percentage of Canadian port income would be transferred to the United States. And fourth, Regulatory Alignment, meaning Canadian ports would adopt U.S. inspection procedures. That last demand is particularly ironic because it would eliminate the efficiency advantage that attracts shipping companies to Canada in the first place. International law experts reacted almost immediately, saying the proposal conflicted with established principles of port sovereignty and international trade law. Many observers drew historical comparisons to colonial-era port concessions, situations where powerful nations demanded control over foreign ports to protect their own trade interests. That comparison spread quickly through diplomatic circles. But perhaps the most important issue isn't whether the proposal was realistic, it's why it was made at all. Consider the sequence of events. Tariffs were introduced, but they pushed trade toward alternative routes. Diplomatic pressure increased, but Canada built new partnerships. Energy threats and political pressure failed to reverse the shift. Each move either failed outright or unintentionally strengthened Canada's position. So when those tools stopped working, Washington reached for something far more extreme. Investor Warren Buffett offered an interesting interpretation. In business, he says, competition tends to follow a pattern. First comes denial, dismissing the competitor. Then imitation, trying to copy them. Then aggression, price wars, lobbying, legal battles. And finally, desperation, demanding access to what the competitor built. Buffett argued that demanding control of Canadian ports fits squarely into that final stage. His reasoning was simple. If you could build a better system yourself, you would. Asking to use someone else's infrastructure suggests you can't. International reaction to the proposal reflected that concern. Governments around the world reaffirmed the principle that nations maintain full authority over their own port facilities. Even inside the United States, the idea drew criticism. Business leaders worried the demand could trigger retaliatory measures that might restrict the access American companies already have to Canadian ports. Members of Congress from both parties questioned whether demanding control of another country's infrastructure made the United States appear weaker rather than stronger. Then, at a press conference in Ottawa, Mark Carney was asked directly whether Canada would ever consider granting the United States authority over its ports. His answer was simple. Canada built the ports, Canadian workers operate them, Canadian trade agreements filled them. And then he delivered a line that quickly spread around the world. You don't get the keys to a house you didn't build just because yours is empty. The metaphor was powerful because it was universal. Anyone can understand the idea of someone demanding access to a house they didn't construct. And the numbers behind the metaphor, ship traffic, container volumes, revenue, made the situation unmistakably clear. Canadian ports are expanding rapidly. American ports are losing international transit cargo. The United States asked for operational authority over Canadian port infrastructure. Canada refused. Where things go next remains uncertain. One path would involve the United States investing heavily in modernizing its own port system and rebuilding trade relationships. The other path involves continued escalation, more pressure, more demands, and more global trade shifting toward alternative networks. Right now, it's not clear which direction Washington will choose. But one reality is already visible in shipping data and container counts. The balance of trade routes has shifted. The trade war was meant to demonstrate American economic strength. Instead, it revealed something unexpected. When the evidence is measured not in speeches, but in cranes, ships, and cargo moving through harbors, the question becomes impossible to ignore. Which country is still building, and which one is asking for the keys?